Hello everyone, welcome to Bauhaus' first live streaming of 2022. Today we will talk about basically form, composition, how this affects works of art from all history. Now the form, any visual language talks to us through form. Anything that we can perceive, we can understand thanks to form. And it allows us to observe it, to analyze it. It speaks to us. It means that everything that is visible is at the same time understandable thanks to the position and composition of elements in a space in a work of art. Okay, just as a quick introduction, my name is Paulina. I am an architect, I am an artist. I specialize in intervention of historical spaces and art history. But let's start first with how we interpret the world around us. I imagine that all of you can understand what we see here. If you don't see a dog, then you might want to check that. But the fact is that if you see this from an objective point of view, we have very few points of information. We have movement, we have the black dots that you see here, but there is nothing else. There is no contour. There is nothing that is telling us actually what we're seeing here. The truth is that our brain always is trying to find the simplest solution. Our body is basically a little bit lazy, so it's trying to find a quick resolution for what we see. And sometimes when we see an image that we consider good, it is because it is very simple for our brain to understand. What does this mean in the case that you're an artist? That your art can be complex, but it shouldn't be difficult to understand, to perceive, and to absorb. Now, there are several laws that the Gestalt, this is the way that is called the Gestalt Laws, that were introduced and developed in the 40s by two psychologists. And they developed several laws, of which I only describe 5 here. The law of closure, where we our mind puts the missing pieces in an image to complete them. The law of likeness or similarity, where we group elements that seem familiar to each other. The law of proximity, where when we have several stimuli, those of them who are closer together, we group them as a whole. Then we have the law of uniformity, the law of background and figure, and the law of continuity, where bodies that tend to go in a similar direction will be felt as one, because the body and our brain is always trying to find unity. Now, that was just a background on how we can read art, but also how we can read the whole world that surrounds us. But now we need to go deeper into what helps us read a work of art. And first of all, is the information that you would find in a technical sheet. For example, if you go to a museum, that small square that you see by a work of art is the first thing, the basic information that we get, which is the context, identifying when and what was surrounding the artist, the history, the politics, the religion, everything that surrounds the artist in the moment of creating. The composition, and that is what we will talk about the whole class, how we read, how we understand the beginning, the middle, and the end of a work of art, and how we understand the narrative. The biography of the author, where he lived, when he lived, which is similar to the context, but specific to the person, to the creator. The style, the characteristics and the elements that we work on, and the message that the artist is trying to convey personally, how we receive it, because a message can be the same, but the way we receive it, each of us might be different. Now, this thing that I'm talking about, the technical sheet, is very simple. I won't stop a lot on it, but it's basically the author, the title, the date it was created, the current location, if it's in private gallery, if it's in a museum, the classification, the technique that was used, the dimensions. But these, for example, are very difficult to understand or to appreciate, really, if we're not physically looking upon the work of art. Let's say that we see these examples in a museum, then we get the physical sensation of the dimension, the technique. We feel that we can touch the old painting. So this is very difficult to perceive when we see a work of art, for example, through the internet. When we see something like these examples to comparative parts, we see that now we can make a reading that is more of a descriptive nature. We can see already the composition, the lines of force, the points of interest, the gaze directions that we will talk about, where the characters are, who the characters are staring at, etc. So this is already a deeper understanding, the treatment of the light and the analysis of the color, etc. If we have any artistic language, any formal expression, we need to understand if it's figurative, if it's showing something that is recognizable, that is something that we actually know and recognize from the world around us, or if it's abstract, if it's something that has a message, or if it's something that is purely decorative. That would be the first point. The second point is to see if it is naturalistic, if it looks like anything from nature, or if it is schematic, which is simplified form, which is taking only the very specific things for you to understand the minimum possible information. For example, the kiss from Brancusi, we know there is a kiss because we understand the gesture of the eyes, a very small mouth, the embrace, but it is in a very simplified manner. When we talk about composition, the composition is the planning, the arrangement of the elements, the adding of the ingredients, which make it very, very rich. Like here, for example, Wes Anderson, which we know that he is the master of composition in cinema, because we are now talking about visual representation, maybe in plastic arts, but we also have to talk about sculpture and cinema and photography and every other art, even the art of movement and theater. They have to think about composition. In this idea of composition, we have several elements that help us, and these are just a few of them: line, form, texture, but also relation between elements, like what has a greater weight or what has greater impact on the eye. For example, here we see a central light. So we know that the central line and the central axis have relevance, and we know that there is a sense of symmetry. So we are starting to talk about this kind of words, gravity and relation between elements, meaning, significance and value and space. And now we are already adding all these words to our lesson, right? Now, when we talk about nature in itself is very chaotic and it's very unpredictable, but at the same time, it has ways of ordering what we see. It has some regularity. It helps us see nature's cycles. And one of the first people who started actually writing about this was Leonardo Bonacci, who later we have come to know as Leonardo Fibonacci, because it comes from Filius. He was the son of Bonacci. He decided that it was time for him to go to India because the Roman numerals felt a little bit limiting and a little bit cumbersome. And so he decided to go to India and to understand how they were expanding on the Arabic numeral system. So they, for example, were the ones who added the 0 and the negatives to the numbers. And Fibonacci was one of the few ones who started developing this mathematical sequence of how nature develops and how you can actually apply that to human creations. So humans actually take these regular patterns and arrangements and copy them to represent them in all history of art. Now, since the beginning of time, for example, here with the cave paintings of Lascaux, we have been trying to understand if there is a compositional instinct to it, if there was any artistic meaning. What the experts have found out is that there might actually not be an artistic intention here, but there are ideas of mystic order, which means actually that there is some sense of compositional instinct. When we go further into art history, the composition starts getting more and more complex, and we will see some of these examples of how it develops from a more simple type of representation to more and more complex. And the first one of them is the axial symmetry. In these examples of more Baroque and more Renaissance examples, we see that even though there is a simple symmetry and kind of mirror-like representation, there is still unity to each part. There is still division between characters and landscape, and there is still a sense that each character is individual and important in a way. If you see, most of them carry their own symbolism and their own gestures. Each character has a meaning, a color, a position in space, even though there is still actual symmetry. If we go further back, then we'll see that in the Romantic and the medieval world, there was less of this individuality. There are groups of people that represent a whole, but maybe not specific characters. And this is when the idea of axial symmetry started as a way of ordering the brain and also ordering the hierarchy that we will talk about. Who is more important than who? What is the size that a character should have in comparison to other that is more important? In contrast with this, in more contemporary art, the geometric structure of networks is used. It is used mostly in contemporary art because it is simpler to the eye, simple to understand, and it allows for repetition. We also have, as we talked about a while ago, hierarchy, which means putting the most important character up and or in a central position. So we know that this person has something to do with the rest of them, but he's actually in a higher plane. Okay, if you've seen, today we have jumped back and forth from art history because we're not talking about a linear art history. We're talking about the cycle of composition, how we start, for example, with chaos, then go to a more orderly type of composition, then go back to chaos, sorry. And this is the perfect example why Kandinsky has been known as one of the most complete artists in history. We will have a specific lesson on him probably this year because he was one of the few who didn't fall into one specific category. He was very into mathematics. He was also a musician. He was also into theory and writing, and then finally studying graphic arts. So if you see, he was a very Renaissance type of artist, a very complete character. For example, in this case, in composition, how he goes from one element to the next. And if you see the original one, you might think that there is a sense of disorder or a sense of randomness, but he actually leads the eye from one point to the next, very simply, in a way that it is not tiring to the eye. In his life, he worked in many more, but mainly three big movements. In the first time of his life, he worked on impressions, which is more naturalist, which is more representing what he was seeing, and very much taking an idea from the Faubist. If you remember one of our last lessons, he's taking the idea of color from the Faubist, and he's taking the type of a stroke from the Expressionists. Then he moved into improvisations, which add a little bit more of intuition. And finally, he goes into compositions, which are very, very rigorous, but still have the sense of not imitating. Compositions are very strict, but still work by a rule of intuition, which he always thought about. We will talk about this later, but Kandinsky always thought that intuition must lead. He was also a synesthetic, which means that he could hear music or at least sounds through color, and when he heard music, he could see color through sound. So this means that his senses can work between each other. Then we have the composition by perspective, in which we have a horizon line, we have vanishing points, and the most important thing about this and Renaissance would be this movement and moment in history when it exploded, is that one, it is scientifically developed, it is very mathematical, and most importantly, the elements in the canvas are actually finally of the size that they should be in comparison to others, according to the depth of the space that they are in. Each element has a size that corresponds to its position in the painting. Finally, we have the composition by free gesture, and you may recognize this artist. This is Jackson Pollock. It is important to understand that the free gesture type of composition shows more than many other type of compositions show the temperament of the artist. You might think that it is very free. You might think that it has a lot of drama and that it shows a little bit of or a lot of disorder. In the case of Jackson Pollock, he himself said many times, and he made it very clear, that there was no disorder, that he was not based in a random throwing of paint. I might add there a question mark to see if that is actually true, but he said that it was all deliberate, that there was a deliberate spontaneity. If we see the videos of him working, it really seems a little bit random, but when we see this type of art, the thing is that the painting covers the whole canvas up to the edge, so that gives us a sense of disorder, as I was saying. So if you're working on abstract art, I would recommend that it is always within the sense of showing clearly the message that you're trying to deliver. How do we know that an artist has thought about composition? Well, each element that we see has a value, each element tells a story, each element provides order and logic. There is no single element that means nothing, that was put there randomly. Even if, for example, in this painting, we see that there is a sense of light, there is a sense of choosing colors to show the message of good and evil. You can see even form and how soft forms are used in the good side, and then darkness and sharp elements are used on the bad side. And everything here is in air quotes because it is very important to remember that art is always subjective. We will see some compositional concepts, just so that if we take small examples from all through art history, you know that they are, most of them, if they are famous, if they are appealing to the eye, it is because they had one or more of these compositional concepts in them. Why? Because if we see something, even if it is strong like Guernica, even if the message is heartbreaking, it can still be something aesthetically pleasing to the eye, simply because it has one of these concepts, in this case, unity, knowing that even if this is a very large mural, because this is not even canvas, this is a very large mural, then we still walk through it and find unity, find that we're following the same story. Hierarchy, that we have already talked about this a while ago, about how the most important element is up or central, and from there everything else grows. Position and tension, in which we see that the elements are pulling on each other. And here I put this graphic representation upright, where you see that the biggest element has a lot of weight and a lot of light, but there are these lines of a very bright point pulling on them. In the composition development and understanding, the 20th century was one of the greatest moments to pull this into theory. Rudolf Arnheim was a psychologist and a theorist who wrote a lot about order and composition in life, not only in art. He thought that if we are able to perceive the world and live in the world without feeling overwhelmed, it is because there are patterns and shapes that we follow and that our brain can understand. He always wrote about how these patterns, if we find a way to read and understand these patterns, then we will find a way to understand life. Now, he connected this to art theory, saying if art is our main way of expressing in the world, if it is our way of visual thinking, this means that art can actually structure life. So if we go further along this line, we will think art can help us understand and give order and peace to our life. What we need to understand about this is that many artists took this frame, this armature, this armor, and brought it into how to organize the element in their own canvases, how they can organize the perception of the viewer in a way that the viewer can understand it and actually enjoy it. And this is Caravaggio, for example. This is the Baroque. He's saying, okay, I will put the elements of tension along this armature, and along with it, I will give light and shadow to follow these lines. Then we have depth, where if you want to go back in Bauhaus's archive, you will see that the very first lesson is on M.C. Escher. He was a chief of impossible figures and paradoxical perspectives and impossible spaces. And the reason he was so good at it is because he could understand perfectly how to represent three-dimensionality in a 2D type of art. The main question of when we see art, because when we go to a museum, we will see so many types of art, would be, does the format determine the composition and the narrative of the piece? In this case, for example, what happens when the narrative is a continuum, when it doesn't show a beginning and an end? In this case, we see that there is a central character that, of course, is the most important, the central element, but what it does is that it places all the other characters on the same plane, on the same dimension. This is mostly for medieval and for Romantic type of art, but it divided the position of the characters according to the body, to the soul, and to the spirit, to what feels more earthly, more linked to our flesh, more passionate, whatever it is that is connected to death, what expires. Then we have a second level, which is the soul, the feeling, the vitality, the heart, and then the final plane, which is the spirit, the eternal, and the thought. We have to understand that this division works for any type of art. So when we talk about weightlessness and gravity, we can actually invert it and play it in a way that seems counterintuitive. In the example of the right, we will see that everything that is out of this world is floating above us, and everything that is more earthly, most linked to the human experience, is down below. In these forms of composition, we've already talked about the elements. Now we're going to talk about the mathematical experience of developing the form. In this case, the golden section is one of the most important. It is connected but not precisely the same as the Fibonacci sequence, and it shows us how the proportion works between small and bigger parts. The larger part is equal to that between the larger and the total. When we see it represented in art, we see that what it creates is a form that gives us steadiness, because the most important thing when we make art or when we perceive art is that whatever we create is grounded. So in this case, the golden section and the asymmetry are works that gives you a grounding line. In the case of the right, letter B, we see that the ratios are based on differences that are so small that they leave our eye unsure. Now, in the second case, with the black background, we see that we prefer the image on the right with the letter B, because then we prefer the image where the lines are clearly orthogonal or clearly oblique in this case. According to the golden section, which we see here used masterfully by Leonardo da Vinci, the whole is divided in two parts in the way that the ratio feels compensated. The golden rectangle can be constructed rather quickly. We take the midpoint of the base, and then we take the distance from the upper vertex, from the corner, to the base to measure the total extension towards the base of the line. And so we have an enlarged rectangle, which is a golden rectangle. You can see it's impressive how he used it in every single element. The golden ratio can also be applied to something similar to the rule of thirds. There are two types of rule of thirds that we can make. One that is through the same ratio of adding the lines to create a golden proportion, or in a way to divide equally in thirds both sides of the canvas, and then showing the intersection as the main point of interest. As we see here, the intersection is actually where the character is positioned. In the interrelation of forms, we have the same rule of thirds, but now also considering color and direction. So in the example to the left, we can see that it is divided, of course, the main line of this abstract work of art follows one of the line of the axis, and the central point is very red, because when we talk about weight, and we will talk a little bit more about this later, but when we talk about weight in a work of art, red weighs more than, for example, blue, and a circular form weighs more than a square. It is something that is used a lot also when representing people, when representing portraits, because you have to keep the eye moving. You have to consider that the eye of the viewer starts, in this case, in Van Gogh case, starts in the face and moves to the right in a circular manner to complete the view. We have then the point of interest, where the position of arms, the position of head, everything follows a line to know where we can find the central and the main part of the information that we see, the story. The light also falls within this frame, as in this example too. In Dr. Taub's anatomy lesson, we see a great example of composition in all senses. He pays attention first to the light. If we see the story, in one of the narratives that we have, the author makes the main doctor, Dr. Taub, open the arm instead of the chest. And this is just so that we see the gesture of his hand when he's trying to explain to the students how a muscle moves the hand. Then he moves his hand to show it. And we already have this sense of grids, the sense of thirds, and the points of interest in, of course, the main characters. The point or the fact that we work in thirds doesn't exclude us from also working with the golden section. So you see that when we see this type of examples, then we understand that it was very well thought of and that it was very developed in paper before going into canvas. Balance occurs when we find equal weight and tone on both sides, either vertically or horizontally. And this doesn't mean that it has to be symmetrical. If you see this, I am not talking about symmetry when I talk of balance. I'm talking of weight and of relevance of elements. In this case, the character and the horse, for example, have the same weight, even though the position of the horse might seem off. So the balance can be through symmetry or through asymmetry. The symmetry creates a sense of order and it relieves tension, and the asymmetry can add individuality. So even if you feel that asymmetry brings disorder, it can actually be a good thing because it will bring more attention, it will break the monotony, and it will bring uniqueness to the image. When we show compositions, they can be either closed or open. They can be closed in a regular axis, in a central axis, with the groups of characters moving towards the center. And this is why it was easiest to use this in the medieval and Renaissance world, because they were trying to show reality and they were trying to show architecture in the most exact way possible, in contrast to open compositions, which try to go out of the canvas with elements that flee, that look, even in this case, for example, with Velázquez, the characters are looking towards us as if they were looking towards a camera, as if we were taking a photograph. The order is still on an axis, but it is fragmented. Weight, which we have been talking a lot about in this class, and the armature. These lines that we see here in Henri Cartier-Bresson are the best example that we have of armatures. Henri Cartier-Bresson lived for 96 years. He was really a boss of photography and of composition in the fleeting moment. He was one of the first that didn't organize the frames that he was going to shoot. And so that is why we find that his images are so intense, because he could find very easily and in movement where was the gravitational point, the gravitational force that was pulling the image, and take the picture. When we talk about weight, we have to consider that the visual weight gives order or chaos to an image, depending if the elements fall along these lines that I mark here. If it falls off these lines, then we might feel the image unbalanced. As in this case, we know that there is a direction through the handrail. We know that there is a point of interest with the ladies right on the point of the armature. And we know that there is, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, the line that is following along this armature here. Some other examples by the same artist, by the same photographer. If you see, the bicycle falls right into the center of interest of the armature, and it helps us also understand which elements feel isolated, which elements weight more. This also coincides with the use of the golden proportion to know that the instability that we find is on purpose. Now, when we talk about symmetry and asymmetry, we have to be careful, just as Ilma af Klint was, that our elements find other ways of finding balance, because symmetry can feel a little bit monotonous, color can help us, and meaning can help us to feel that the image is not boring or that it doesn't mirror itself just for the sake of it. In the case of Ilma af Klint, we see tension, and we see that the colors that she uses and even the meaning give subtlety to this symmetry. It doesn't feel passive, it doesn't feel unbalanced, it doesn't feel complex, it can be read easily. And specifically in her case, if you've seen the other classes about Ilma af Klint, you'll know that she left open for interpretation, but always within the lines of religion and spirituality, and art as a medium to connect to the beyond. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who we will talk about in the class of the Bauhaus, is a great example of collages. He was a master of balance and how to manage points of interest and the lines of the armature to create tension and to give resolution. What I mean with resolution, when we talked about Gestalt in some of the first images, we were talking about how our brain tries to find the easiest solution so that we can feel the image is complete and that we're at peace. He works through these lines of balance in a way that they still feel a little bit precarious, but with a lot of coherence and with a lot of games of weight. And also, if you see these images, a lot of games of symbolism. Finally, we have direction, a direction that helps us move the eye in a way that the artist wants us to. For example, how the formal elements mark a relationship between one to the next, and they also relate the forms to the image to a meaning. So the way the eye moves also tell a story of what characters we must see first and which characters we must see second. We see induced directions by the looks, by the gestures, by the movement, and we have the way we read the image. If it feels chaotic, if it feels calm and pleasant, if it feels violent. Now try to see this image again without the lines, the 8 lines. You can see that your eye might have moved the same way even if you didn't see the lines that are helping you. If you see the arm that is falling, you can see that the arm is almost, not physically, but visually pushing towards the slab that is below, right? So if the hand hadn't been touching, if there was air between the elements, you would feel that the weight of the characters, they don't have where to land. So what the artist does here is that the hand is actually overlapping, touching the element below, so that you can feel that the weight of the characters have somewhere to fall. Direction also works in a way that you don't need to have physical elements moving from one side to the next. A gaze is more than enough to show a line to follow with the eye. Our own eyes go first to the face of the character and then to the element that the character is watching. Finally, we're going to go back to the example of Guernica so that you know how we can read this type or any other type of art. We have a central point of interest and lines of tension, because there is a lot of tension in this type of art. You will see that Picasso uses the idea of curved lines when talking about the softness of a character, and then he uses very strong triangular forms when he wants to talk about violence. So here in this first yellow triangle, I am showing the distribution of the visual weight. So we have mass and we have a visual weight that we are most attracted to, and then how we divide into different centers of interest in the composition. I will talk about this in February's class that will be the second part of Pablo Picasso, but just as a small introduction, we can see elements as Picasso himself represented as a bull. A bull can be the representation of violent passion, of creativity, but also of a signature of himself. He saw himself as this animal. So he represented here as a way of protecting the people that are suffering in Guernica. Then we see a crying horse that has been stabbed. We see a fallen soldier down below. And all these elements that I'm talking about are connected one to the next, so that our eye falls from one to the next in a way of a narrative, or in a more descriptive way. So if you see, this image is very, very strong and very violent, but still very beautiful. Okay, so I hope this class helped you understand more or less what are the elements of composition that helps us read a work of art, how we can read it without even knowing anything of the technical sheet, so we can understand the intention of the artist. Even if we don't know who the artist is, we still know what he meant when he made these works of art. All that is good is beautiful, and beauty does not come without regular relationships or proportions. So thank you very much for following along this class, and I will be answering questions if you see the rerun on YouTube or through Patreon. Thank you very much, and see you next time.